This video is brought to you by my patrons. If you want to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/MaggieMayFish and by ExpressVPN.
Hey, are you a film nerd? Do you like movies? I bet you do. Have I got a YouTube video for you? Here's 100 facts that you missed about The Shining. Let's see how much you know about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Fact number 100. Jack Nicholson looks straight into the camera both times he talks about killing his family. Fact number 99. Kubrick's daughter, who directed the behind-the-scenes making of The Shining, is now a Scientologist. Fact number 98. Stanley Kubrick is considered by many a genius. Fact number 97. So genius, in fact, that he traveled back in time to reinvent the camera. So now we call these Kubricks. Where was I? Well, sometimes it's hard to make sense of the world. Reality can be irrational and chaotic. When life gets too overwhelming, we often turn to symbols for comfort, whether it's religion or astrology or our own fantasies and thoughts. Symbolism helps us make sense out of life. It gives us something solid to cling to.
The Shining and Lost Highway were made 17 years apart, but both feature an abusive husband who takes his anger out on his wife and everyone around him. Both films take us inside these men's minds as we watch them build elaborate fantasies to justify their actions. Both directors draw from the horror genre, showing us terrifying and impossible events. And both Kubrick and Lynch's work looks at the ways in which violence radiates out from the protagonist to everyone around them. How these men ruin their lives and the lives of the women around them, how much destruction it causes, and how little the lives of others play into their calculations. Both directors are keenly interested in the reality of domestic violence under the veneer of polite society. But before we get lost on a highway, let's take a trip to the Overlook Hotel.
The long history of people interpreting The Shining is almost as interesting as the film itself.
Although the film is broadly considered a classic now, it was actually reviewed pretty negatively at the time. It even earned 2 Golden Raspberry nominations in 1980. Stanley Kubrick for Worst Director, who lost out to Robert Greenwald for Xanadu. Apologies for the Xanadu blasphemy. And Shelley Duvall for Worst Female Actor, who lost out to Brooke Shields in The Blue Lagoon. I'm okay with Blue Lagoon blasphemy.
Hoochie Gucci, see him jiggle, wiggle a check.
A review attributed to the Variety staff at the time criticized both leads, saying, "The crazier Nicholson gets, the more idiotic he looks. Shelley Duvall transforms the warm, sympathetic wife of the book into a simpering, semi-beep hysteric." Writing for the LA Times, Kevin Thomas said, "Both those expecting significance from Kubrick and those merely looking for a good scare may be equally disappointed." Aside from the harsh opinions, the film was interpreted as a spooky ghost story about a family man who becomes possessed by a hotel and slowly turns violent. In a Newsweek article that came out around the same time of the film's premiere, film critic Jack Kroll described Jack Nicholson's character as the nice guy from Vermont becomes a raging fiend. He describes Jack's smile as the facial barometer by which we read the state of his soul as it sucked deeper and deeper into demonism by the black forces that infest the huge hotel. This interpretation of the film sees Jack, Wendy, and Danny as a stereotypical happy American family at the beginning of the film, and the hotel as the film's antagonist that brings its evil into their lives through Jack.
But it was commercially successful, and over the years the film has gained notoriety, eventually becoming viewed as a Kubrick classic. And with that status came many, many reinterpretations of the story.
From socio-political interpretations, like the idea that the film is a commentary on the genocide of the indigenous people who lived on the land where the hotel was built.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
Makes sense. To theories that melded with conspiracy theories, like the one connecting the film to Kubrick's supposed role in the fake moon landing.
And this deeper story has its birth, I guess, in the idea that Stanley Kubrick was involved with faking the Apollo moon landings.
And this one I hate. A few of these theories were covered in the 2012 documentary Room 237. And of course, YouTube is also fertile ground for The Shining interpretation videos.
The common thread with the interpretations that I've mentioned so far is that they tend to lean really hard into the symbolic, sometimes at the expense of remembering the character's humanity.
They see Jack, Wendy, and Danny as stand-ins for larger societal ideas rather than a story about a real family. Which definitely makes sense. I mean, that's the type of director Kubrick is, always implicating larger ideas in his work.
But Kubrick is a director that works on both a symbolic and literal level. And recently there's been quite a few grounded readings that feel a bit more accurate, at least to me, and more importantly, they feel more human.
For example, this YouTube video that discusses the cycle of violence in the Torrance family. It looks at the original novel's description of Jack's childhood abuse at the hands of his father, his hatred of his mother, and the way Jack projects those violent, resentful feelings onto his own wife and son. It argues that in the film, it wasn't the hotel that turned Jack evil. Jack's been evil all along.
You've always been the caretaker.
Or this video, which argues that there's no ghosts in the entire story, that they're simply a symbolic representation of the character's emotions, fears, and anxieties. When Jack is interacting with ghosts, there's often a mirror, suggesting that he's actually speaking to himself. This reading's also supported by Kubrick's shot selection. The establishing wide shot of Jack and Grady breaks the 180-degree rule. In conventional Hollywood film grammar, Jack should be looking the same way in both of these shots. Meaning that Jack and Grady mirror one another, not just in their reflections in the mirror, but in the blocking and composition of the shot themselves, or the reality of the scene. These readings still allow for broader societal implications in The Shining, but they center the personal, literal story of a father who abuses his son and gaslights his wife, suggesting he's always been this way, and always will be.
You've always been the caretaker.
In this reading, the true horror of the story is the fact that Jack is capable of treating his own family this way. But a horror that is unfortunately commonplace. A horror that could affect any seemingly normal American family. The everyday horror just under the surface of polite society. When Jack sees ghosts, it's the visual representation of his perverse desires, conflicting with his conscience, eating away at him. When Wendy sees ghosts, that's her trying to make sense of Jack's lies. When Danny sees ghosts, it's his anxieties and inability to process the terrible things that his father has been doing to him. We see how each character feels. One of the strongest visuals that stays with you is the man in the bear costume. In this one shot, Kubrick combines both the symbolic and the literal story. This image is creepy because it's an explicitly sexual act with a teddy bear, a toy that's usually associated with childhood. This is Wendy's horror, that Jack is abusing Danny. These readings make more sense to me every time I watch the film. I mean, based on how Wendy describes Jack in the opening sequence, he's already a bona fide a-hole.
My husband had been drinking, and he came home about 3 hours late. Danny had scattered some of his school papers all over the room, and my husband grabbed his arm, to pull him away from him. On this particular occasion, my husband just used too much strength, and he injured Danny's arm.
The first time we see Jack with his family, he's barely hiding his seething contempt for them.
I saw it on TV.
See? It's okay. You saw it on the television.
And this happens on the way to the Overlook. They're not even there yet. Kubrick spoke to a similar sentiment in 1980 when he said,
"One of the things that horror stories can do is to show us the archetypes of the unconscious. We can see the dark side without having to confront it directly."
Directly confronting the horrors of child abuse and spousal abuse would be too much for a mainstream popcorn flick. A lot of the more, passionately abstract readings of The Shining
Stanley Kubrick was involved with faking the Apollo moon landings.
more often than not try to draw some deep secret out of the film at the expense of talking about the other story, that of a father abusing his son and wife. Sometimes we need that layer of horror genre symbolism. We need the ghosts and the river of blood and the spooky twins.
That horror imagery actually comforts us because it allows us to view the literal narrative through detached, symbolic genre conventions.
On the first watch, two twin ghosts appearing out of nowhere is much more frightening than Danny being held by his father. But the more times you watch The Shining, the jump scare increasingly loses its bite, to where now I look forward to seeing the twins. But this scene with Jack and Danny only gets scarier and scarier. Steadicam operator Garrett Brown noted that Kubrick likes centered compositions because they have a Palladian quality, which refers to a highly symmetrical style of architecture. The cinematography throughout The Shining is constantly centered, with the subjects right in your face. It feels like Kubrick is daring you to accept what's right in front of you.
That's number 44. Kubrick had an IQ of 1,000 midichlorians. One of the main themes in The Shining is the way that we tell different versions of the truth.
In the scene where the pediatrician asks Wendy about her son and her husband's relationship, Wendy tells the version of events from Jack's point of view.
Just one of those things, purely an accident.
Jack didn't mean to do it, she swears, all the while nervously shifting in her seat. Later, Jack repeats the exact same excuses to the bartender in the Overlook.
I did hurt him once, okay? It was an accident.
With that motif of mirrors that we mentioned earlier, Jack is talking into a mirror here, reassuring himself that this version of the story is true. And of course, he's looking directly into the camera, implicating us, the audience, in his alibi too. My favorite little Easter egg that illustrates Jack's distortion of the truth is when he lies about remembering the Grady murders. In one of the first scenes, the manager, Mr. Ullman, asks Jack if he knows anything about the tragedy that happened at the hotel a decade before. Jack says he's intrigued but doesn't know anything about it. But later in the film, when he meets Grady in the bathroom, Jack lets the truth slip.
I recognize you. I saw your picture in the newspapers.
And in 1980, you couldn't, Google headlines. When Jack says that he saw Grady's photo in the paper, he's implying that he remembered seeing it back when it happened, 10 years earlier. Jack knew about the murder-suicide and also knew it would be safer for him to feign ignorance in the job interview. He lied to his employers and his wife and his son and maneuvered himself and his family into the isolated Overlook. It was Jack's choice. Another major theme in The Shining is choice, or free will. Lloyd, the bartender, asks Jack,
"What would be, sir?"
At the beginning of two pivotal sequences, when Jack follows Danny into room 237, and when Jack decides to murder his family.
What'll it be, sir, is also a callback to Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, made a decade earlier.
The central theme of that film was the concept of free choice, and the phrase, "what's it gonna be then?" appears in the film when the priest asks the inmates how they're going to choose to live the rest of their lives.
What's it going to be, eh?
In the original novel by Anthony Burgess, that line is also spoken by the protagonist, Alex, over a dozen times. That story hinges on Alex's choices, and the central conflict of the novel involves the government literally taking away Alex's ability to choose for himself. So in Kubrick's The Shining, there's this underlying theme of Jack's free will, but that free will is excused and obscured by the fantasy, happy family narrative that the characters tell themselves. Jack's very intentional choices, the choice to abuse Danny, the choice to take a job at a hotel where he knows a murder took place, the choice to murder his own family in the hotel, are presented as just things that happened, as accidents.
It was an accident.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
Throughout history, men like Jack have used their privilege to erase the truth of their own agency. Jack, like Grady before him, and the builders of the Overlook before them, all wash away their own guilt, their culpability, which only comes flooding back later as a river of blood. In the first act, we never see Jack at home with Wendy and Danny. Everything that we think we know about their home life is what Wendy, Jack, and Danny have told to complete strangers, just as we, the audience, are essentially strangers in this moment. So we're expected to believe Wendy and assume Jack is a loving father, but Jack was a monster all along. The audience is expected to assume that American history is a clean, heroic, white man's burden, to be dazzled by the glitz and glam of old Hollywood and the ruling class. But it was white supremacy all along. Part of the horror of The Shining is the casualness of these statements, the understated way that whoever is speaking dismisses the unbearable reality in favor of a lie.
Once you rule out his version of what happened, there is no other explanation.
It's the everyday, banal sentiments that paper over violence inherent in our culture.
When the film came out, Kubrick spoke to this too, saying,
"There's something inherently wrong with the human personality. There's an evil side to it.
Beneath the surface, American history is not a fun cowboys and Indians fairy tale, but rather one successive violent display of dominance after another.
White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
And all of this ties back to the public reaction to A Clockwork Orange after its release in 1971, which ignited a debate about whether or not violent media is responsible for violent crime. Instances of violence were attributed to the film. In one instance, a group of men sexually assaulted a 17-year-old while singing in the Rain. In another, a 16-year-old boy, supposedly obsessed with the film, beat a 60-year-old unhoused person to death. Violent media was just the easy scapegoat. Politicians could blame Clockwork Orange rather than addressing the root causes of crime. In 1974, Kubrick even pulled A Clockwork Orange from being shown in England after it had been running for 3 years, concerned by all the violent crimes attributed to the film. Reacting to criticisms of the violence in the film adaptation of his novel, Anthony Burgess said,
"Neither cinema nor literature can be blamed for original sin. A man who kills his uncle cannot justifiably blame a performance of Hamlet. On the other hand, if literature is to be held responsible for mayhem and murder, then the most damnable book of them all is the Bible, the most vindictive piece of literature in existence."
Blaming media for violence is especially absurd in England, considering the British Empire was built on violence. Colonization, genocide, environmental destruction, systematic racism, and slavery. So it's a bit of a pot calling the kettle black situation. Of course, the history of the United States is similarly horrific.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground.
And American politicians are just as quick to blame violent media, just like they did after Columbine to avoid facing the difficult truths like police incompetence. Or when a former US president, whose favorite hobbies includes inspiring violent domestic terrorist attacks, blames violent video games for the very violence that he casually incites. All this despite the fact that study after study has found no causal evidence that violent video games lead to aggression in the real world. The idea of a single film or video game possessing an otherwise good kid and turning him into a murderer is as absurd as the idea of a magic hotel possessing an otherwise good father and turning him into a murderer. The Shining came out in 1980. A Clockwork Orange came out in 1971. So the fact that we're told that the Grady murders happened about a decade before the events of The Shining feels like a nod to the fact that it had been about a decade since Kubrick released his last ultra-violent film. The last two shots of The Shining also mirror the last two shots of A Clockwork Orange, both visually and thematically. The penultimate shot features the main character with his eyes rolling back in his head, which then cuts to an image of a party where the main character is the center of attention. Alex takes refuge in his violent fantasies, while the Overlook Hotel, a metaphor for society, is a refuge for Jack's violent fantasies. Around the release of Clockwork Orange in 1971, Kubrick spoke about the way Hollywood portrays violence.
When you ask, is it right for violence to be fun, you must realize that people are used to challenging whether certain types of violence are fun. You see it when your Western hero finally shoots all the villains. Heroic violence, in the Hollywood sense, is a great deal like the motivational researcher's problem in selling candy. The problem with candy is not to convince people that it's good candy, but to free them from the guilt of eating it. We have seen so many times that the body of a film serves merely as an excuse for motivating a final blood-crazed slaughter by the hero of his enemies, and at the same time, to relieve the audience's guilt of enjoying this mayhem.
And looking at the last few shots of these films side by side, it definitely feels like Kubrick is satirizing Hollywood's love of violent climaxes.
After a string of massive successes in the 1960s, from Lolita to Dr. Strangelove to 2001: A Space Odyssey.
By the release of Clockwork Orange in 1971, Kubrick positioned himself as one of the most powerful directors in the film industry. His relationship with Warner Brothers assured him complete control, but not just over his films, even over the marketing and distribution details.
Kubrick had so much sway that when he was displeased with how Warner Brothers was distributing his film internationally, he forced Warner Brothers to fire the chief executive of Warner International. Kubrick's attention to detail was so extreme, if a local newspaper didn't feature the screening times for every single showing of his film, he'd call up the person in charge and chew them out personally.
That same sense of control extended to every aspect of production, from production design to lighting to hyper-specific camera directions. Steadicam inventor and operator Garrett Brown recalled,
I quickly realized that when Stanley said the crosshairs were to be on someone's left nostril, that no other nostril would do.
And of course, the sense of control extended to directing his actors. But before we get into Kubrick's style of directing actors, let's take a look at the history of acting. The art of acting is ancient. As time went on, acting techniques changed in response to evolving stories and spaces. Because what works in a gigantic coliseum may not translate with an actor is a few inches from a 4K camera. By the time Chekhov came into the scene in the 1800s, actors needed to portray real-life people with internal conflicts. This was a big change from earlier writers like, say, Shakespeare, whose characters would monologue their internal thoughts and feelings. Enter the OG, Stanislavski. And in 1909, he drafted his system of method acting, which relied on the popular psychological idea of affective memory, where an actor refers to a part of their own life to bring up real emotions to portray a character. This is like if my character is going through a breakup, I can think back to breakups that I've gone through. I can remember how I felt, the emotions involved, and spring them forth from an internal truth. Stanislavski mentored many prominent actors who later developed their own methods based off of his teachings, including Stella Adler, Sanford Meisner, and Lee Strasberg, who developed method acting. Strasberg really believed in this emotional memory, that it was better for actors to actually have lived similar experiences to the characters they're portraying. But when Stanislavski found out just how far Strasberg was pushing this idea, Stanislavski very publicly revived his earlier methods, favoring imagination work and physical realities like touch, smell, and taste to bring characters to life, without the actor having to put their mental health or life or body in danger. This evolution of the acting method was very important because, well, Strasberg's method was very limiting. How are you going to use emotional memory to portray God? To portray Iago, the Shakespeare character, not the bird. But more importantly, Stanislavski's revisions to his theory keeps the actors safe. Acting requires you to be very vulnerable, and it's too much to ask your actors portraying a traumatic scene to actually be traumatized to portray it accurately. Your imagination, your empathy, your understanding of people and emotions can do all that work for you. Going back to that breakup scene, the smell of Marlboro cigarettes brings a very specific emotion to me. Being in a scene with my partner and picking up an imaginary whiff of that tobacco brings a pit to my stomach, 1,000 times more real than if I sat for an hour remembering the last time someone broke up with me, because frankly, it was their loss. When Strasberg heard that Stanislavski had revised his old methodology, Strasberg was like, I see your point about my actors being traumatized, and I'm gonna revise my methods based on a less literal translation of your previous work. Just kidding, he said, I'm right, you're wrong, haha. And that's why today we have Jared Leto sending his co-workers condoms and dead rats and calling it part of his process. Now, this is obviously an oversimplification. If you're interested in more on this topic, check out Bro Chanel's video. Every actor is going to have a completely different process for what works for them. And these techniques just offer an avenue to get to the same end, portraying a truthful character. Stanislavski's evolved methodology is so important because it puts the actor first. It puts their imagination first, their bodies first, their mental health first. And it allows actors to portray suffering without having to suffer themselves. These are all things that Kubrick would have been familiar with, right? I mean, he's not tour. That means he's one of the best directors, right? Anne Jackson, who played Danny's doctor, recalled that Kubrick pretty much refused to direct her. She had to do the same scene over and over and over and over, but when she'd ask for direction, he'd just give her a look as if to say, why do you ask questions? She said it made her feel like a child in school who had done something wrong. Malcolm McDowell also recalled feeling left on his own while working on A Clockwork Orange. Early on, when he asked Kubrick if he had any ideas for McDowell's character, Kubrick just teased him by saying, I'm not the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. Even Matthew Modine, who speaks very fondly of Kubrick, said that Kubrick directed his actors by not telling you what he wants. Biographer Vincent Labruto spins Kubrick's directing style in a way that's almost poetic, saying that he worked with his actors through indirection. Okay, sure, dude. Despite Kubrick's reputation for being hands-off with his actors, Shelley Duvall had a notoriously terrible time under his tyrannical direction. Labruto described Kubrick's treatment of Duvall as positively as he can by saying,
Kubrick maintained a psychological advantage over Shelley Duvall by making her feel that she wasn't giving him what he wanted.
"This is some amazing verbal gymnastics. Labruto makes Kubrick the subject of the sentence, but manages to make Shelley Duvall the object of a preposition. Duvall, the human person, is secondary to the abstract idea of a psychological advantage." Much of the legend about Kubrick's treatment of Duvall comes from the behind-the-scenes featurette Making the Shining, directed by Kubrick's daughter, Vivian. In it, Duvall shows Kubrick that her hair got caught in a window in the last take, ripping out clumps of it. And Kubrick mocks her for it.
Pulled all my hair. I pulled hunks of hair out on the windowsill. And the back got caught.
Hunks of hair.
Oh, look.
Okay.
Kubrick tells the crew not to sympathize with her.
Fine, don't sympathize with Shelley.
At one point, Duvall misses when Kubrick calls action because she's given conflicting directions from various crew members, and Kubrick chastises her for missing her cue, even though it's not her fault. From Labruto's telling of it, this is all simply Kubrick's technique, his highly advanced, very professional method of maintaining a psychological advantage. Kubrick trusts Jack to play evil without being evil, but he didn't trust Duvall to play terrified without being terrified. Kubrick was basically forcing Shelley Duvall to participate in method acting. I guess you could say Kubrick was method acting. Kubrick's tone dismissing Duvall's feelings is eerily similar to when Jack dismisses Wendy.
Hunks of hair.
Oh, look.
Okay.
It's just a matter of settling back into the habit of writing every day.
That's all it is.
Okay.
It feels like he was trying to recreate the Jack-Wendy dynamic between himself and Duvall. Of course, another word to describe Kubrick's method of directing Duvall, especially in contrast to the way that he treated Jack Nicholson, would be misogynist. So why drag out all these stuffy acting theorists whom I worship and have a shrine built to in my closet next to my character's shoes? Because Kubrick himself said that he read Stanislavski. But from that interview, it sure seems like he only understood Stanislavski's early, less refined techniques. Making The Shining is more than just a raw behind-the-scenes look at the making of a movie. It's also a well-crafted narrative itself. The video frames Stanley Kubrick, Jack Nicholson, and Shelley Duvall in a very specific, very gendered hierarchy, with Kubrick at the tippy top, Nicholson the superstar right beneath him.
The average celebrity meets in 1 year 10 times the amount of people that the average person meets in his entire life.
And then Duvall, the girl who has trouble acting, squashed beneath their boots. In the middle of the video, we see Shelley Duvall talking about how popular and famous Jack Nicholson is, and how sycophantic people are towards him.
There were times where I felt a bit jealous because he got very, very much attention. And I suppose I like attention.
After that, it immediately cuts to Shelley Duvall lying on the ground having an actual panic attack, suggesting that she's doing this for attention. And Kubrick wasn't just telling the crew not to sympathize with Shelley.
Fine, don't sympathize with Shelley.
He was telling us, the audience, not to sympathize with her. Toward the end of the video, Duvall herself justifies Kubrick's treatment of her.
If it hadn't been for that, volley of ideas and sometimes butting of heads together, it wouldn't have come out as good as it did.
But also, she seems terrified.
And it also helps get the emotion up and the concentration up, because it builds up anger, actually, and you get more out of yourself.
But this feels like we're watching her relive her trauma, which Kubrick subjected her to, and I don't like it. There's this tendency to view Making The Shining as raw, behind-the-scenes footage shot without intention, rather than what it is. A marketing tool for both the film and its stars. And by its stars, I mean Jack Nicholson and Stanley Kubrick. Pretty much everything we know about directors is PR and marketing, carefully drafted and approved by executives and their legal departments. Making The Shining feels very much like an attempt to get ahead of the rumors about Shelley Duvall being treated horribly on set, especially knowing what we know about Kubrick's absolute control over the marketing of his films. And this is just the footage that Kubrick let us see. In an interview for British television, when the host asked Duvall about the rumor that she had to do 127 takes, Duvall says,
I don't know, I think I'm supposed to say 18.
She's supposed to say 18? It's not hard to imagine that Kubrick is the one who decided on this talking point. But whether he did personally or not, it's a masculine studio system, telling a traumatized actress what to say in public, eerily mirroring Jack feeding Wendy what to say about Danny. Earlier this year, Angelica Houston, who was living with Jack Nicholson during the filming of The Shining, recalled,
"It seemed to be a little bit like the boys were ganging up. That might have been completely my misread on the situation, but I just felt it. And when I saw her during those days, she seemed generally a bit tortured, shook up. I don't think anyone was being particularly careful of her."
Among all these stories and clips and quotes about Kubrick's direction of Duvall, there's one thing that gets glossed over. Kubrick chose to direct Duvall this way. It wasn't how he normally directs his actors. It definitely wasn't how he directed Jack Nicholson. It was clearly intentional. But language like, Kubrick maintained a psychological advantage, erases that choice. It's not that Shelley Duvall felt terrible or felt miserable. It's that Kubrick made her feel like she wasn't giving him what he wanted. And this is one of the messed up things that auteur theory can do. It frames Kubrick, the auteur, as the unquestionable hero. He is fighting for the truth, fighting for his artistic vision. And it casts Shelley Duvall as this bug-eyed monster who can't act that Kubrick must vanquish to save his film. This narrative expects us to believe that Kubrick had no choice but to abuse Duvall this way. That Kubrick had no free will. That he had to do it for his art. And as a result, his agency is washed away. People also love to just not bring up Kubrick's Lolita, besides also missing the mark on it being a story about a groomer and not a love story. The treatment of actress Sue Lyon was also disappointing. During the casting process, Kubrick asked underage Lyon all types of invasive questions about her sex life, and Kubrick's producing partner, James Harris, started dating Sue Lyon when she was only 14 years old. If you want to hear more on that matter, check out episode 2 of Lolita Podcast by Jamie Loftus. But Kubrick's lack of regard for his actors wasn't reserved only for women. Malcolm McDowell has spoken at length about the multiple injuries he sustained while working on A Clockwork Orange.
"I scratched the cornea of my left eye. It hurt, I couldn't see. Kubrick said, 'Let's go on with the scene. I'll favor your other eye.'"
He's also spoken critically of Kubrick as a director.
Stanley, I think what stops him from being a genius, for me, is this lack of humanity. It's this withdrawing, this brilliant, yes. Extraordinary, yes. I mean, one of the greats, yes, all that. At the end of the day, they say, well, what was he like as a man? What was he like as a human being? I think that's probably the test that he doesn't do well at.
And coming from McDowell, that's really saying something, considering the type of roles that he's tackled throughout his career. Auteur theory is often used to justify bad behavior as part of the artistic process. This idea says, without the director's controlling, domineering, or even sometimes abusive attitude, the actor wouldn't be able to produce the same groundbreaking work. That's how that works, right? The director directs, and then the actor does what the director says, and then it turns out great because the director directed it, right? Right?
Right? Fact number 39. Brain from Pinky and the Brain was designed after Kubrick.
Right.
It's the powerful, strongman director who pulls the performance out of the actor. It makes the director essential and the actor a non-essential prop to be consumed and then tossed aside. Kubrick's The Shining is a film about patriarchy and the cycles of abuse, whose means of production seem to reproduce that same pattern of patriarchy and abuse in order to represent those ideas. He's like, hey, look, I made a movie about this bad thing. But in making the movie, he did the bad thing. David Lynch's Lost Highway is also a film about patriarchy and the cycles of abuse, whose means of production, as far as I can tell, used safe, collaborative methods to represent those ideas. First, though, if you're not familiar with Lost Highway, it's a very weird, very surreal, very dark story about a husband who's so obsessed and jealous about his wife, he murders her get sent to death row, and then sinks so deeply into denial that he literally becomes another guy. This other guy then meets a woman who's suspiciously similar to his wife. He becomes obsessed and jealous about her, and then more violence ensues. And it gets weirder by the end with characters disappearing and reappearing out of thin air. Patricia Arquette, who stars in the movie, summed up the themes of the film at the time.
To me, it's sort of a movie about looking at women through the eyes of a misogynist, a man who hates women. So he's totally obsessed with her, can't love her enough, can't have her to himself enough, can't kill her enough times, will rebirth it, try to get a chance at their relationship again, but even in his fantasy of it, it gets all screwed.
Definitely not a movie to watch if you're triggered by sexual violence or trauma. In another interview, when Patricia Arquette describes the relationship between the husband and wife, it's eerie how accurately she's also describing the relationship between Jack and Wendy in The Shining.
They have a very dishonest relationship. I mean, I think she's in a way very fearful of him. She doesn't know what he's really capable of. He doesn't want to admit who he really is. They have a stalemate relationship where it's almost like in their marriage you feel that the word divorce is just constantly between them, but it's almost like a standoff of these two animals.
In every interview I could find about the production of Lost Highway, Arquette and the other prominent female actor, Natasha Gregson Wagner, spoke of a very safe, supportive set.
He inspires trust from the actor, which, with the emotional stuff or the sexual stuff, you want to trust your director and feel safe with them, and he really cultivates that.
Arquette even chose the role specifically to challenge herself.
Part of the reason I did this movie was that I have a serious phobia about nudity, just in my general everyday life, I've spent most of my life taking baths in the dark. When I'd have to do scenes with men, he would take them off beforehand, and I don't know what he said to them, but I would come in and they would look at me differently. They would look at me like, I'm sorry, I'm looking at you. I feel for you. I know this is hard for you, So there was a lot of humanity on the set.
This collaborative, supportive feeling on set seems to run throughout Lynch's filmography. In Blue Velvet, Isabella Rossellini had a similarly challenging role. When the film was released in 1986, critics like Roger Ebert criticized the film for being exploitative.
I think this movie is cruelly unfair to its actors. He asked Isabella Rossellini in this movie to be undressed and humiliated on the screen as few actresses ever have been. It's not how Isabella Rossellini reacts to the fact that she's standing there nude and humiliated on the lawn of the police captain's house with lots of people watching. It's how I react.
She wasn't giving him what he wanted.
And that's painful to me, to see a woman treated like that, and I want to know that if I'm feeling that pain, it's for a reason that the movie has other than simply to cause pain to her.
But Rossellini responded,
I resent that. It takes away from me, from my judgment. It says I'm so helpless that a director can make me do something I don't want to do. I'm not a kid. I understood the film. It's beyond that. I loved it.
And I want to make it clear that Rossellini is talking about her choice to take the role in the first place, which is different from Shelley Duvall agreeing to take a challenging role, but not being able to predict the extreme traumatic conditions that she'd eventually face once she was on set. Whereas Angelica Houston mentioned that the filming of The Shining felt like the boys ganging up on a girl, Isabella Rossellini even described her co-star, Dennis Hopper, who plays the terrifying mobster, Frank Booth, was a supportive co-worker.
He wasn't so paternal or protective that it was impossible to be frightened of Frank. Yet he didn't intimidate me at all. It was important for me to trust Dennis, which I did. He was mostly sardonic and very comical. He found a way to be a fellow actor.
But let's merge back onto the Lost Highway. Beep, beep. Fred is obsessed with dominating his wife, just like Jack was obsessed with dominating Wendy. And we see Fred's violent passion come out through his art. Sax music, just as Jack's violent passion is linked to his art, writing. There's this distinct difference between how Bill Pullman portrays Fred and how Jack Nicholson portrays Jack. Fred is obviously passionate, but his passion is always mixed with frustration, resentment, and anger. His character never gets to feel joy. Not when he's playing sax, not when he's having sex, definitely not when he's having sex. Fred doesn't even seem satisfied when he finally murders Renee, just confused, frustrated, and angry. Same goes for Fred's alter ego, Pete. There doesn't seem to be anything that makes him truly happy. He only feels jealousy and anger. All these closed-off negative emotions make it really hard to empathize or identify with Fred/Pete. But that's an accurate portrayal of toxic masculinity and misogyny. And quite frankly, I like that it's harder to empathize with this character. He's terrible. Jack, on the other hand, is filled with glee throughout many scenes in The Shining. It's like the film is inviting us to enjoy the violence along with Jack, inviting us to take part in terrorizing Wendy, and especially through the making of documentary, terrorizing Shelley Duvall. Nothing seems to make Jack happier than trying to murder his family. His joy is one of the things that makes this film so terrifying. The idea that a father would happily slaughter his family is a nightmare. But at the same time, joy is contagious, which makes it easy to identify with Jack. And that may be even more terrifying. There's also a distinct difference between how Shelley Duvall portrays Wendy and how Patricia Arquette portrays Renee/Alice. I think Shelley Duvall did an amazing job, as good a job as she could have under Kubrick's direction. But his direction is actually what I think limits the character, for me, by keeping Wendy at an emotional distance and forcing her to be passive. Her fear is palpable, but she isn't allowed to really express much emotional range beyond that. She's always reacting in response to Jack's actions, which are horrifying, but we get no sense of her inner life or personal desires. In the end, she doesn't even get to defeat Jack. And yes, part of that is Kubrick subverting audiences' expectations about violence, but he does it in a way that prevents Wendy from achieving catharsis, and prevents the audience from feeling catharsis through Wendy. Patricia Arquette's character, though, gets to feel fear, joy, shyness, confidence, lust, disgust, and pity. She even reaches catharsis while subverting audience expectations about violence. After the film's final sex scene, she whispers,
"You'll never have me."
right into Fred's ear before confidently walking out of the movie. There is a violent climax, but it's between Fred and Mr. Eddie, the mobster who also wanted to own Alice. The empathetic character achieves catharsis, while the men who were obsessed with her destroy themselves. Kubrick really does seem to understand the way that husbands and fathers terrorize their wives and children. He seems to understand the genocidal history of Western culture. He's really good at describing patriarchal white supremacy. It's a key theme running throughout most of his filmography, and that's one of the reasons that I also really love Kubrick. It can feel good to have something that's right in front of everyone's faces pointed out so clearly and eloquently. But I'm not really sure what Kubrick is saying about it in The Shining. Other than, it's terrifying and destructive, it exists, and it will always exist. Description is not analysis. Accurately describing a problem is an important first step in addressing that problem, but it is just one step. Sometimes when I'm watching The Shining, or even some of Kubrick's other films, I feel like I'm in a theater full of men who are sitting around going, isn't it weird that men are like this? Isn't it weird that we're just allowed to act this way? Isn't it weird that the society we built is like this for us, while patting each other on their backs for being so smart and sophisticated because they can appreciate a brilliant movie, all the while ignoring the fact that they're the ones who maintain that same awful society. It doesn't feel like Kubrick offers any solutions. It feels like we're just trapped in this never-ending cycle, that it's just the way it is. I think Malcolm McDowell is right. Kubrick seems to lack humanity.
It's the human element. If he could eliminate that, he could probably make the perfect movie.
We started working on this video while the many allegations against director David L. Russell started coming out, and it's not hard to see how this behavior has been perpetuated and excused, or even treated as essential to making good art. But auteur theory is just the symbol that we cling to, while the truth is staring us in the face. My point isn't to argue that Lost Highway is better than The Shining, or that Lynch is the better of the two directors, or that Kubrick is an irredeemable monster whose movies should all be buried in a landfill, next to all the copies of his Lolita film, which should be buried in a landfill. In David Lynch's work, I do find a sense of empathy for the victim, though. And that empathy feels transformative. His work is often brutal, yes, sometimes hard to watch, for sure. Lynch's work is not for everyone, and I also have my criticisms, most obviously being about diversity in his casting. But in addition to describing patriarchy, Lynch offers an alternative: empathy.
The foundation of such a method is love.
I love you too, Cher Truman. Fact number 1 is coming up right after this message from our sponsor.
This video is brought to you by ExpressVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, masks your IP address and creates a secure connection between your device and the internet. This protects you from hackers whenever you're connected to an unsecure network, and even your ISP from logging the sites you visit and selling your data to advertisers. And it has a lot of other handy uses. ExpressVPN can reroute your connection through a server in another country, making websites think that you're located in that country. For this video, I obviously had to watch The Shining a bunch of times, and I just hopped onto Netflix and, oh wait, it's not on Netflix in the US. Good thing I have ExpressVPN on my computer. I just changed my location to Australia. I wish. Refresh the page, and I can watch The Shining until my eyes bleed. And it's not just The Shining. You can get thousands more movies and shows on Netflix simply by switching locations. Oh hey, look, Lost Highway. Thanks, Poland. ExpressVPN has over 3,000 servers located in 94 different countries, giving you a wide variety of options. Plus, ExpressVPN is rated the #1 VPN by CNET, TechRadar, The Verge, and Wired. Find out how you can get 3 months of ExpressVPN for free by visiting expressvpn.com/mmfish or clicking on the link in the description box below.
And finally, fact number 1.
Blue skies and golden sunshine all along the way. Everyone, have a great day.
Thank you so much for watching, and thanks as always to my lovely patrons whose support makes it possible for me to make these videos. If you want to see your name in the credits alongside these fine folks, go to patreon.com/MaggieMayFish and sign up. Thank you to Patrick Willems and Lola Sebastian for lending me their voices for Kubrick and all the quotes. You can find their links in the description box below. Until next time, save Martha! Save Martha!